Good morning, dear students. So now actually we are taking finally the block number 5th of British poetry, and in this block we would like to talk about the postmodern poetry and the postmodern literature. In our earlier discussions and sessions, we talked about modern poetry and modernist poetic literary developments in English literature. And there we talked about you see recent writers, and now we are going to take the postmodern literature. Postmodern literature is literature characterized by heavy reliance on techniques like fragmentation, paradox, and questionable narrators, and is often, though not exclusively, defined as a style or trend which emerged in the post-World War II era. Postmodern works are seen as a reaction against Enlightenment thinking and modernist approaches to literature. So, as we were talking, you see, in our last sessions about the modern literature and the modernist movement, in the same way, we are now talking about the postmodern literature. It was, you see, a bit different from the modern literature. You see, it is characterized by heavy reliance on techniques like fragmentation, paradox, and questionable narrators, and is often defined as a style or trend which emerged in the post-World War, you see, particularly after Second World War time. So, yeah, the postmodern literature is particularly related, you see, after the Second World War it took place, and you see, the postmodern works are seen as a reaction against Enlightenment thinking and modernist approaches to literature. So postmodern movement and the postmodern literature particularly decomposes the modern trends and the modern set of approaches, and they take everything for the judgment, and they take everything for the critical consideration and evaluation. As we were talking, the postmodern literature, like postmodernism as a whole, tends to resist definition or classification as a movement. So, as we were talking, actually, postmodern literature is very much influenced by the postmodernism, and that tends to resist definition or classification as a movement. Indeed, the divergence of postmodern literature with various modes of critical theory, particularly reader response and deconstructionist approaches, and the subversions of implicit contract between author, text, and reader, by which its works are often characterized, have led to pre-modern fiction such as Cervantes' Don Quixote, Ed Lawrence Strand's 18th century satire, Tristan Sandy being retrospectively inducted into the fold. So, my dear friends, as we were talking, you see, the postmodern literature has got various modes of critical theory, particularly the reader response theory and the deconstruction approaches, etc., etc. So through those approaches, through those sets of patterns, they evaluate the piece of literature and they write the piece of literature. And on the other part, actually, they take everything into consideration, like author, like text, and reader, by which its works are often characterized. So, as a matter of fact, they take simultaneously many things into consideration, like author, text, and reader, while they go into it, while they take any text for a fresh evaluation, for a literary judgment, etc. In the same way, as we were talking, while there is little consensus on the precise characteristics, scope, and importance of postmodern literature, as is often the case with artistic movements, postmodern literature is commonly defined in relation to a precursor. For example, a postmodern literary work tends not to conclude with the neatly tied up ending, as is often found in modernist literature. The writers are, you see, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and Faulkner, but often parodies it. Postmodern authors tend to celebrate chance over craft, and further employ metafiction to undermine the writer's authority. Another characteristic of postmodern literature is the questioning of distinctions between high and low culture through the use of pastiche, the combination of subjects and genres not previously deemed fit for literature. So, as a matter of fact, you see, the postmodern literature takes into consideration, you see, the characteristics and the scope and importance of the particular text. And it takes the things in the relation and the, you see, connotative relationship and the contemporary relationship of the text. For example, you see, the postmodern literary work tends not to conclude with the neatly tied up ending as it is found in modern literature, but it will take the other side of the text and it would like to parody, it would like to make the parody of it. In the same fashion, the postmodern writer has also got their different approaches. They will, you see, and they would like to judge the writer's authority. They would like to find out, they would like to critically evaluate the writer's, you see, the approach to the particular text. So all those things actually are taken into consideration in the postmodern literature. You see, so we were trying to understand so far the postmodern literature, and now we would like to understand the Dylan, you see, a very important poet of postmodern poetry, Dylan Marlis Thomas. So, but before we go into the understanding of Dylan Marlis Thomas, we would like to understand some, you see, something more about postmodern literature and postmodernism is. So, as we were trying to understand in our last sessions, in our last discussions actually, you see, after modernism, postmodernism comes. So, modernism actually, or the modern age, was the age actually that was dedicated for novel writing and the poetry writing. So, there was as such not much difference in the modern period and in the Victorian period as far as writing is concerned. But when we see the postmodern period, when we see the postmodern literature, there was a drastic change into the writings of, you see, literature and into the understanding of the writings of literature. That is the main point that we need to understand, that the postmodern age or the postmodern era or the postmodern literature gave a new thinking, a new side to the mind, a new understanding to the mind in order to interpret that literary text actually. And in the postmodern literature, many things bent into it, the text and the writer and the time. So actually they started deconstructing the text actually, and you see the postmodern writer and try to explain that it is not the author who gives the meaning. Reader response theories and many other theories were there, and who propagated actually that it is not the author who gives the meaning, but it is the reader also who can give the meaning to the text. So this is how actually the reader response theories try to give different angles, different points of views, different, you see, critical understandings to the text. And this is where the postmodern literature, the postmodern thinking and the postmodern era is very much different from the modern era. So this was the time actually, the postmodernism was the time when the writers and the critics tried to take a different angle in order to evaluate the text. And you see, there were many writers, and Dylan Marlis Thomas was one of them. Now we would like to discuss Dylan Marlis Thomas, who was born on 27th October 1914 and died on 9th November 1953, was a Welsh poet and writer whose works include the poems "Do Not Go Gentle into the Good Night" and "Death Shall Have No Dominion," the play for voices under Milkwood, and stories and radio broadcasts such as A Child's Christmas in Wales and Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog. So as we were talking, my dear friends, he was a very important poet of the postmodern poetry. He's basically a Welsh poet, and he is known for his many writings and many poems. And he became popular in his lifetime and remained so after his premature death in New York. He became very much popular at his very early age, and he remained popular till he died. In his later life, he acquired a reputation which he encouraged as a roistering, drunken, and doomed poet. So, Marley's Thomas, as we were talking, is considered a very important poet, a very important leading figure of postmodern literature and postmodern poetry, along with his very distinguished works. Thomas was born in Swansea, Wales in 1914, an undistinguished pupil. He left school at 16, becoming a journalist for a short time, although many of his works appeared in print while he was still a teenager. It was the publication of Light Breaks Where No Sun Shines in 1934 that caught the attention of the literary world. So he was born in Wales actually, and you see, without any particular recognition, without any distinguished feature, he left the school when he was only 16 years old. And later on, because he wanted to become a journalist. And you see, he was not very much popular until his one work, that was Light Breaks Where No Sun Shines, came out. And later on, when this work, Light Breaks Where No Sun Shines, came out in 1934, you see, he became a bit popular, and people started noticing him. While living in London, Thomas met Kathleen McNamara, whom he married in 1937. The relationship was defined by alcoholism and was mutually destructive. In the early part of his marriage, Thomas and his family lived hand to mouth. They were very poor in the you see, initial years. Thomas and his family lived a very bad life as far as the livelihood is concerned, settling in Bill's fishing village of Longhorn, and they were living a very pitiable life. But later on, things improved. Although Thomas was appreciated as a popular poet in his lifetime, he found earning a living as a writer difficult, but resulted in his augmenting his income with reading tours and broadcasts. So as we were talking in our earlier slide, my dear friends, you see, Thomas is appreciated as you see, everywhere for his postmodern poetry, but it was very difficult for him to manage his life, and it was very difficult for him to manage his life, particularly as far as livelihood is concerned. His radio recordings for the BBC during the later half of the 1940s brought him to public's attention, and he was used by the corporation as a populist voice of the literary scene. In the 1950s, Thomas traveled to America, where his readings brought him a level of fame, though his erratic behavior and drinking worsened. His time in America cemented Thomas' legend, where he recorded to vinyl works such as A Child's Christmas in Wales during his fourth trip to New York in 1953. Thomas became gravely ill and fell into a coma from which he did not recover. Thomas died on 9th November 1953, and his body was returned to Wales, where he was buried at the village churchyard in Longhorn. So as we were talking, actually, you see, he could not get a permanent job, and he was suffering all through the life in order to get a particular job, to improve his life. And because of such situations and because of the hardships of life, he could not manage, and he fell ill and he died very early. Although writing exclusively in the English language, Thomas has been acknowledged as one of the most important Wales poets of the 20th century. As we were talking, my dear friends, you see, exclusively, as far as the exclusive English writing is concerned, he is designated, he is known, he is reputed, he is acknowledged as the most important Wales poet of the 20th century. He is noted for his original, rhythmic, and ingenious use of words and imagery. He uses particularly, you see, native words. He uses the words from his culture, from his local languages. Thomas' position as one of the great modern poets has been much discussed, though this has not tarnished his popularity amongst the general public who find his work accessible. So, as we were talking actually, that you see, it has been discussed a lot. There has been a lot of discussion about his popularity in the, you see, in the arena, in the galleries of the literary circles and among the groupings of critics. But it has not impacted, you see, the opinions of general public. In general public, his popularity remains for what he deserved for, and he was really popular, and he was the poet of masses, and he remains so. And you see, after understanding the great poet of postmodern poetry, you see, Marlis Thomas, now we would like to discuss about Philip Arthur Larkin, and we would like to understand Arthur Larkin and his, you see, the bent of mind and his, you see, the development he did for the postmodern poetry, what he did for postmodern poetry, that we would like to understand in our discussion. So, Philip Arthur Larkin, who was born on 9th August 1922 and died on 2nd December 1985, was an English poet, novelist, and librarian. His first book of poetry, The North Ship, was published in 1945, followed by two novels, Jill and A Girl Inventor, and he came to prominence in 1955 with the publication of his second collection of poems, The Less Deceived, followed by The White Sun Beddings and High Windows. So, you see, he was a very famous English poet, novelist, and librarian, and you see, actually, he became famous because of his collection of poetry and some important novels. And you see, then actually he contributed to the Daily Telegraph. This was a journal where he contributed a lot. He contributed to the Daily Telegraph as its jazz critic from 1961 to 1971. Articles gathered in All What Jazz, a record diary in 1961 to 71, and he edited the Oxford Book of 20th Century English Verse. His many honors include the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry. He was offered but declined the position of Poet Laureate in 1984 following the death of John Badgeman. So he was offered the post of Poet Laureate also, but he did not accept in 1984. Such was, you see, Arthur Larkin. And then, after graduating from Oxford in 1943 with a first in English language and literature, Larkin became a librarian. So after graduating from Oxford in 1943, he became a librarian. It was during the 30 years he worked with distinction as university librarian at the Burnmore Jones Library at the University of Hull that he produced the greater part of his published work. His poems are marked by what Andrew Motion calls a very English, glum accuracy about emotions, places, and relationships, and what Donald Davy described as lowered sights and diminished expectations. So, you see, Larkin, after some time in working in the field of language and literature, he became a librarian, and later on, actually, he started, you see, his poems are particularly marked for glum accuracy about emotions, about places and relationships. So his poetry is known particularly for these things actually, which are expressed by the English critics and for which he is known. Eric Homburger, echoing Randall Jarrell, called him the saddest heart in the post-war supermarket. As you know, the postmodern poetry, as you know, the postmodern literature is very much concerned, is very much related to the post post-war situations, particularly the Second World War situations. So, you see, what critics say about Larkin, you see, one critic, Eric, says about him, he was the saddest heart. He was the saddest heart in the post-war supermarket. And Larkin himself said that deprivation for him was what daffodils were for Wordsworth. Deprivation for him was what daffodils. You see, this will very clearly, clarify the meaning of romanticism and postmodern poetry. In postmodern poetry, the meaning of deprivation was thoroughly expressed by Larkin in his poetry. In the same fashion, the daffodils, expressed the nature or the meaning of the nature in the romantic poetry. Daffodils was exercised by William Wordsworth for his nature poetry. In the same fashion, deprivation was exercised for postmodern poetry by Mr. Larkin. So, influenced by W.H. Auden, W.B. Yeats, and Thomas Hardy. He was very much influenced by Auden, Yeats, and Thomas Hardy. His poems are highly structured but flexible verse forms. So his poems are structured, but they are very flexible in their nature. They were described by Jean Hartley, the ex-wife of Larkin's publisher, George Hartley, as a piquant mixture of lyricism and discontent. So, you see, other critics says about his poetry, about his poems, and it is piquant mixture of lyricism and discontent, they say. Though anthologist Keith Tuma writes that there is more to Larkin's work than its reputation for dour pessimism suggests. So this is what about Larkin, you see, it has got a pessimistic bent of attitude actually. The poetry has also got the pessimism in it. Larkin's public persona was that of the no-nonsense solitary Englishman who disliked fame and had no patience for the trappings of the public literary life. The posthumous publication by Anthony Trollope in 1992 of his letters triggered controversy about this personal life and political views described by John Banbele as hair-raising, but also in places hilarious. Liza Jardine called him a causal, habitual racist and an easy misogynist. But the academic John Osborne argued in 2008 that the worst that anyone has discovered about Larkin are some crass letters and a taste for porn softer than what passes for mainstream entertainment. Despite the controversy, Larkin was chosen in the 2003 Poetry Book Society survey almost 2 decades after his death as Britain's best-loved poet of the previous 50 years, and in 2008 the Times named him Britain's greatest post-war writer. So as we were talking actually, there were many controversies, but still he is one of the best-loved poets of the previous 50 years. And you see, he was his name was included in 2008 in the Times as a greatest post-war writer. In 1973, Coventry Evening Telegraph reviewer referred to Larkin as the Bard of Coventry. He was, referred as the Bard of Coventry also. But in 2010, 25 years after his death, it was Larkin's adopted home city, Kingston upon Hull, that commemorated him with the Larkin 25 festival, which culminated in the unveiling of a statue of Larkin by Martin Jennings on 2nd December 2010, the 25th anniversary of his death. So, as we were talking in our last slides, you see, there were many arguments, there were many debates, but still, you see, his popularity never went down, and he was nominated as the best loved poet, and he was the greatest in the post-war poetry also. And, you see, Sylvia Plath, another very important name in postmodern literature, in postmodern poetry, who was born on 27th October 1932 and died in February 11, 1963. She was an American poet, novelist, and short story writer born in Boston, Massachusetts. She studied at Smith College and Newham College at the University of Cambridge before receiving acclaim as a poet and writer. So what we were talking, my dear friends, you see, Sylvia Plath is also a noted poet. She was basically an American poet. She married fellow poet Ted Hughes in 1956. They lived together in the United States and then England and had 2 children, Freda and Nicholas. Plath suffered from depression for much of her adult life, and in 1963 she committed suicide. Controversy continues to surround the events of her life and death, as well as her writing and legacy. So actually we were talking that it was a disastrous marriage of Sylvia Plath with Ted Hughes, actually, because she was under depression for the most of time in her adult life, and later on she committed suicide also. Plath is credited with advancing the genre of confessional poetry and is best known for her 2 published collections, The Colossus and Other Poems and Ariel. In 1982, she won a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for the collected poems. She also wrote The Bell Jar, a semi-autobiographical novel published shortly before her death. So she is particularly known for confessional poetry. This is a very important point. You see, there is an Indian poet also, who is Kamala Das. She is also known for confessional poetry, and in the same way, you see, Sylvia Plath is also known for confessional poetry. And now we would like to discuss about confessional poetry and Sylvia Plath. So as we were talking, confessional poetry is a genre of poetry first identified in the decades immediately following the Second World War. It was initiated with the publication of Robert Lowell's life studies and other poets whose work typifies the style includes Sylvia Plath. So actually, confessional poetry is a particular genre that is identified after the Second World War situation. It was initiated by Robert Lowell's work, Life Studies. But actually, it talks about a person. A person actually actualizes his or her feelings in literature, and that is known as confessional poetry. Sylvia Plath, Theodore Ruth, and Annie Sexton, with its origin in the British Romantic poets of the 19th century, such as Wordsworth and Coleridge, confessional poetry of the modern era focused on inward expressions of conflict and emotion through the use of extremely personal details from the poet's life. Critics sometimes include the beat poets, particularly Allen Ginsberg, in this movement. So confessional poetry actually has got the expression of the inner self. Sylvia Plath is commonly seen as a confessional poet, although some critics dispute her placement with its movement, arguing that her work is more universal than commonly assumed. So you see, there is an argument, and that has to be there, that you see some of the poets and critics said, no, she is not much related to the confessional kind of poetry, and you see, she is more universal than commonly assumed. Nevertheless, Ariel, published posthumously in 1965, deals with the very personal issues of suicide, sex, her children, and most dramatically, her complicated relationship with her deceased father. Poems like Daddy, Ariel, and Lady Lazarus are stunning in their originality, wit, and brutality. So actually, as far as these elements are concerned, because she talks about the issues of suicide and sex and her personal children. So if these issues are related, then definitely it is a kind of confessional poetry. So you see, she is known particularly for this, and this is how the postmodern poetry goes, my dear friends. And you know, we were talking about the postmodern poetry and the postmodern and important writer. This is very much related to the postmodern writers and their what they did for the development of poetry. This is what we try to understand. Thank you.